The old school loomed in front of them, its once stately facade now a crumbling relic of the past. Ivy clung to the weathered bricks, creeping up toward shattered windows like the fingers of some long-forgotten ghost. Above the main entrance, the words St. Mark's Academy were barely visible, choked by decades of neglect and decay. A chill wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint scent of smoke that clung stubbornly to the autumn air. Natalie shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her as she glanced at her companions. Chris, ever the thrill-seeker, was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning, his camera already poised to capture the first sign of anything out of the ordinary. Behind him, Jenna and Marcus exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves evident in the way they hovered close to one another, as if their closeness could ward off whatever malevolence lurked inside. "Are you sure about this?" Jenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but it hung in the air, heavy with doubt. "Come on, Jen," Chris said with a playful smirk. "This is what we came for. Think of it as our very own ghost story. We'll be legends in the urban exploration community." Natalie rolled her eyes but couldn't help feeling a twinge of excitement herself. She'd always had a fascination with the paranormal, and the stories about St. Mark's Academy were the stuff of nightmares. According to local legend, the school had been abandoned after a tragic fire nearly 40 years ago. It was said that the spirits of the students and teachers who perished in the blaze still roamed the halls, unable or unwilling to move on. "Let's just get this over with," Marcus muttered, his eyes darting to the shadowed windows as if expecting to see a face staring back at him. With a deep breath, Natalie led the way up the cracked stone steps, pushing open the heavy wooden doors. They creaked ominously, the sound echoing through the darkened corridors beyond. The air inside was thick, musty, and laced with a strange, acrid scent that made her wrinkle her nose. "Smells like something still burning?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. Chris adjusted the settings on his camera, the soft whir of the lens focusing the only sound in the oppressive silence. "Probably just mold or something," he said, but there was a slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his bravado. The group stepped into the foyer, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the cracked tiles. The walls were lined with old photographs, the faces of students long gone staring back at them with haunting, empty eyes. Natalie's gaze was drawn to a large portrait of a stern-looking headmaster, his expression severe, as if warning them to turn back while they still could. A sudden creak echoed from somewhere deep within the school, followed by the faint sound of footsteps. Natalie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The others exchanged nervous glances, their bravado slipping away like smoke on the wind. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely more than a breath. "Probably just the building settling," Chris said, but his eyes were wide, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Natalie felt a cold draft brush past her, raising goosebumps on her arms. It felt as though someone, or something, was watching them, just out of sight. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died on her lips as a low whisper drifted through the hall, indistinct but undeniably real. "What was that?" Jenna asked, her voice quivering with fear. "Let's keep moving," Natalie said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "We need to stick together." As they ventured deeper into the school, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very walls were alive with the voices of the dead, and with each step they took, the air grew colder, heavier, the weight of the school's dark history pressing down on them from all sides. They were not alone in St. Mark's Academy. The whispers of the past were growing louder, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and twisting as if reaching out to claim them. Natalie knew in that moment that the stories were true. Something had been waiting for them in the dark, and now that they were here, it wasn't going to let them leave. The corridor stretched on like a tunnel, each door they passed seeming to close in tighter around them. Faded plaques still hung above the doorways, marking the once vibrant classrooms now swallowed by darkness and decay. Natalie's flashlight beam wavered as she tried to ignore the creeping dread that slithered up her spine. The whispers had faded, but the silence that replaced them was somehow worse, a thick, oppressive void that seemed to absorb even the sound of their footsteps. "Over here," Chris called out, his voice barely rising above the quiet. He stood in front of a door that hung slightly ajar, the wood warped and blackened by time. "Let's check this room out." Jenna hesitated at the threshold, her hand gripping Marcus's arm tightly. "I don't like this, Chris. What if—" "We're already here," Chris interrupted, pushing the door open with a slow, agonizing creak. "Might as well see what's inside." The room beyond was a ghostly remnant of its former self. Rows of desks sat in neat lines, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if waiting for students who would never return. The chalkboard at the front of the room was blank, but the faint outline of old lessons could still be seen, scrawled in a teacher's precise hand. Broken windows allowed thin beams of moonlight to spill into the room, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. "This place is unreal," Chris murmured, raising his camera to capture the desolate scene. The flash illuminated the room in stark white light, momentarily banishing the gloom. But as the light faded, the darkness seemed to return with a vengeance, deeper and more malevolent than before. Natalie moved to the front of the classroom, her fingers brushing against the dusty surface of the teacher's desk. The wood was cold, almost icy to the touch, and she quickly withdrew her hand, wiping it on her jeans as if to rid herself of the strange, lingering chill. She could almost picture the room as it had once been, filled with the noise and energy of children, the walls lined with colorful posters and projects. But now it was like a tomb, and the weight of its tragic history pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. A sudden sharp sound shattered the silence. A loud bang, like the slamming of a door. Natalie whirled around, her heart racing, only to see Marcus standing near the back of the room, his face pale. Did you see that?" he stammered, pointing to the corner where the shadows seemed to gather the thickest. "What happened?" Natalie asked, moving closer, her flashlight flickering as she tried to steady it. "I thought I saw someone," Marcus whispered. "A kid, just standing there. But when I looked again, it was gone." Jenna let out a small, frightened gasp, her grip tightening on Marcus's arm. "Can we please leave? This place is seriously freaking me out." Before anyone could respond, the door behind them slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The explorers jumped, their flashlights darting toward the now sealed exit. Chris ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Locked," he muttered, his voice edged with frustration and fear. "How is that possible?" As if in response, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the air turning frigid. Natalie could see her breath misting in front of her, and she knew they weren't alone. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, growing darker, denser, until they began to take on familiar forms, small, childlike shapes that stood silently between the desks, their faces obscured by the gloom. "They're just kids," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "But they're not really here, are they?" The shadows moved slowly, methodically, until they surrounded the group. The air filled with a low hum, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within their bones. Natalie felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the oppressive energy of the room pushing down on her until she could barely stand. Then, all at once, the whispers returned, louder this time, more distinct. They filled the room, echoing off the walls, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that spoke of fear, pain, and despair. Natalie clutched her head, trying to block out the noise, but the voices only grew louder, more desperate. In the center of the room, the figure of a teacher materialized, her form flickering like a damaged film reel. Her face was twisted in anguish, her eyes wide with terror as she mouthed words that Natalie couldn't quite understand. The ghostly students turned toward her, their expressions vacant, as if waiting for her to speak, to give them direction one final time. Suddenly, the teacher's gaze snapped to Natalie, her eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her, and the whispers coalesced into a single, dreadful word. Run! The spell was broken. Natalie grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her toward the door. We need to get out of here now! Chris and Marcus were already at the door, pounding on it, trying to force it open. With a final desperate push, the door flew open and they tumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The whispers faded as they stumbled away from the classroom, but the feeling of being watched, of being pursued, never left them. As they fled down the dark corridor, Natalie cast one last glance over her shoulder. The door to the classroom slowly creaked shut, as if the school itself was sealing away its secrets once more. But she knew they had awakened something, and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The group barreled down the hallway, the oppressive darkness closing in around them, as if the school itself was trying to swallow them whole. Natalie's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind reeling from what they had just witnessed. The sound of their footsteps echoed eerily, but beneath it, she thought she could still hear the faint whispers, relentless, persistent, pursuing them through the labyrinthine corridors. We need to find a way out, Marcus panted, his voice taut with panic. We shouldn't have come here. No kidding, Jenna snapped, her eyes wide with fear as she clung to his arm. This place is cursed. Chris slowed down, peering into the shadows as he tried to get his bearings. The main entrance is that way, right? He asked, pointing down a hallway to their left. Natalie hesitated. Something about that direction felt wrong, as though a heavy presence lurked in the shadows, waiting for them. No, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I think we should go this way. She pointed down the opposite hallway, where the doors to the auditorium loomed large at the end. Chris frowned, glancing between the two paths. You sure? That looks like a dead end. I don't know, Natalie admitted, but I feel like we're being led somewhere. Maybe the auditorium has another exit. It's worth a shot. Reluctantly, the others nodded and followed her lead. The hall grew darker as they approached the large double doors of the auditorium, the dim light from their flashlights barely penetrating the thick gloom. Natalie felt a wave of dread wash over her as she reached out to push one of the doors open. The door groaned loudly as it swung inward, revealing the vast, shadowy interior of the auditorium. The smell of smoke was stronger here, mingling with the scent of old wood and decay. Rows of seats stretched out before them, shrouded in darkness, and the stage at the far end was barely visible in the feeble light. Doesn't look like there's another way out, Chris muttered, shining his flashlight around the room. But something caught his eye, and he froze, the beam of light fixed on the stage. Wait, do you guys see that? Natalie squinted into the darkness. On the stage, a grand piano sat alone, its black lacquered surface reflecting the faint light. But it wasn't the piano itself that had caught Chris's attention. It was the fact that its keys were moving, slowly and deliberately, as if played by an invisible hand. A haunting melody began to fill the room, each note dripping with sorrow and loss. "That's not possible," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "No one's there. How is it playing by itself?" The music echoed through the auditorium, growing louder, more insistent. Natalie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The melody was beautiful, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, as though it was beckoning them closer, luring them into the dark heart of the room. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice rising with fear. "Now." But as they turned to leave, the auditorium doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. Jenna screamed and they all spun around, yanking at the door handles in a desperate attempt to escape. But the doors wouldn't budge, as if they had been welded shut by some unseen force. The piano music swelled, filling the room with its mournful tune. Natalie turned back toward the stage, and her heart nearly stopped. Figures were beginning to materialize out of the darkness, ghostly, translucent shapes that took on the form of teachers, their faces twisted in agony. They moved slowly across the stage, reenacting their final moments as the fire consumed them. One teacher, her hair scorched and her clothes charred, clutched at her throat, her mouth open in a silent scream as she collapsed to the floor. Another stumbled across the stage, his eyes wide with terror before being engulfed by invisible flames. The scene played out over and over like a nightmarish loop that refused to end. Natalie backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The spirits seemed oblivious to their presence, trapped in an endless cycle of death and despair. But as she watched, the music shifted, growing darker, more menacing. The spirits on stage turned their hollow eyes toward the group, and Natalie felt a suffocating wave of malevolence emanating from them. "They know we're here," Chris whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to do something." But before anyone could react, the piano stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The ghosts on stage began to advance, their forms flickering and twisting as they moved closer to the edge. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Natalie felt a bone-chilling cold seep into her very soul. "We have to get out," she said, her voice shaking. "There has to be another way." With renewed urgency, the group scrambled through the aisles, searching for any exit. As they neared the far end of the auditorium, Natalie spotted a side door, half hidden by the shadows. She ran to it, her hands trembling as she turned the knob. To her immense relief, it opened. "This way!" she shouted, holding the door open as the others rushed through. They tumbled into a narrow hallway, the door slamming shut behind them as if the school itself was trying to keep the horrors contained. The air was warmer here, less oppressive, but the memory of the spirits lingered like a dark cloud over them. As they leaned against the walls trying to catch their breath, Natalie knew that their ordeal was far from over. The school had shown them just a glimpse of its horrors, and there was no telling what awaited them in the deeper shadows. They had escaped the auditorium, but the malevolent force that haunted St. Mark's Academy was not going to let them go so easily. The narrow hallway stretched out before them, winding deeper into the bowels of the school. The oppressive weight of the building's dark history pressed down on them with each step they took. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, their nerves frayed from the relentless onslaught of paranormal horrors. The hallway twisted and turned, leading them into an unfamiliar part of the school, where the air grew thick with the scent of mildew and something far more sinister, an acrid, smoky stench that clung to their clothes and skin. "This place feels wrong," Jenna muttered, her voice barely audible. She clung to Marcus's arm, her eyes darting nervously at the shadows that seemed to creep along the walls. "Everything about this place is wrong," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But we need to keep moving. We can't stay here." Chris led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as they stumbled into a large room at the end of the hallway. The walls were lined with rusty lockers, their doors slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, had rifled through them in a hurry. The smell of smoke was even stronger here, and the temperature had risen uncomfortably, a stark contrast to the bone-chilling cold they had felt in the auditorium. "The locker room," Chris said, glancing around. "Maybe there's another exit." Natalie wasn't so sure. The room had a claustrophobic feel, the air thick and stifling. She could almost hear the faint echoes of laughter and chatter, long since silenced by the tragedy that had befallen the school. As they ventured deeper into the room, the sound of dripping water reached their ears, the steady plop, plop, plop echoing in the stillness. "Look at this," Jenna whispered, pointing to the walls. Scratched into the peeling paint were dozens of names, some barely legible, others carved deep into the plaster as if in desperation. Natalie ran her fingers over one of the names, the edges rough and jagged. "These are the names of the students who died in the fire," Natalie realized, her voice tight with dread. The weight of their discovery settled over them, a grim reminder that they were walking through a place where so many lives had been tragically cut short. Chris took a shaky breath and nodded. "We need to get out of here. This place is a tomb." They began to search the locker room for any sign of an exit. As Natalie approached a row of lockers at the back of the room, she noticed something strange. The metal doors were vibrating ever so slightly, as if something inside was trying to get out. "Guys," she called out, her voice tense, "there's something moving in the lockers." Jenna and Marcus joined her, staring at the trembling lockers with wide eyes. Chris approached cautiously, his hand outstretched as if to open one of the doors. "Don't," Natalie warned. But it was too late. Chris yanked open the locker door, and a wave of heat hit them, along with the overpowering stench of burning flesh. The locker was empty, but the metal inside was searing hot, glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. Chris jerked his hand back with a cry of pain, cradling it to his chest. "What the hell?" he gasped, staring at his reddened palm. "It's like it was on fire." Before anyone could respond, the other lockers began to rattle violently, the doors swinging open and slamming shut on their own. The temperature in the room skyrocketed, and Natalie could feel sweat trickling down her spine as the heat became unbearable. The sound of the lockers slamming grew louder, more frantic, until it was a deafening roar that echoed through the room. "Out! We need to get out!" Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. They rushed toward the door, but as they did, the floor beneath them began to tremble, cracks spreading through the tiles like a spider's web. Natalie stumbled, her heart racing as she realized they were being trapped, the building itself conspiring to keep them there. "We're not going to make it," Jenna screamed, her voice shrill with terror. The lockers suddenly stopped their relentless slamming, the room falling into an oppressive silence. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the group as they stood frozen in fear. The heat remained, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on them from all sides. Then, as if summoned by their fear, the locker doors slowly creaked open once more. But this time, it wasn't just heat that emerged. A thick, black smoke began to pour out of the lockers, swirling around them like a living entity. Within the smoke, they could make out vague, humanoid shapes, students and teachers, their forms twisted and charred beyond recognition. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their mouths opened in silent screams, as if reliving their final moments. Natalie's heart pounded in her chest as the smoke began to close in on them, the ghostly figures reaching out with hands that seemed to solidify as they neared. The heat was unbearable now, searing their skin, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning. "We're going to die here," Jenna whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "No, we're not," Natalie said, though her voice trembled with fear. She forced herself to think, to push through the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "The door! We have to get to the door." But as they made their way toward the exit, the smoke surged forward, cutting them off. The ghostly figures within it became more defined, their eyes locking onto the group with a malevolent hunger. The walls of the locker room seemed to close in, the heat intensifying until it felt as though they were standing in the heart of the fire that had consumed the school. In a desperate bid for survival, Natalie grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it at the smoke. It passed through harmlessly, but the sudden movement seemed to startle the spirits, causing them to hesitate for just a moment. It was all the time they needed. "Go!" Natalie shouted, pushing Jenna and Marcus toward the door. They ran for their lives, their bodies screaming with the effort as they burst through the door and into the hallway beyond. The smoke didn't follow, retreating back into the locker room as if it had been repelled by some invisible barrier. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound echoed through the hallway, a final, ominous note that left them trembling and gasping for air. As they leaned against the cold, damp walls, the heat finally subsiding, Natalie realized that the school wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was playing with them, trapping them in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. And somewhere deep within St. Mark's Academy, the spirits of the dead were waiting for their next move. The group staggered through the hallway, the terror of the locker room still fresh in their minds. Their footsteps echoed in the suffocating silence, the flickering beams of their flashlights the only source of light in the pitch-black corridors. Every creak of the old building, every distant sound, sent shivers down their spines, reminding them that the school was very much alive and it had no intention of letting them go. "We need to keep moving," Natalie urged, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. She was painfully aware of how vulnerable they were, trapped in a place that was designed to disorient and terrify. "There has to be a way out of here." "Where are we even going?" Jenna asked, her voice a shaky whisper. "It feels like we're just going in circles." "We can't just wander aimlessly," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "We need to find a place to regroup, somewhere we can think." Chris slowed down, his flashlight sweeping across the walls until it landed on a set of heavy wooden doors at the end of the corridor. "There," he said, pointing. "Let's check that out." The doors were massive, adorned with intricate carvings of old books and classical figures, their surfaces darkened by years of neglect. Natalie felt a strange pull toward them, as if something was beckoning them inside. She hesitated only briefly before pushing one of the doors open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a vast library, stretching up to a high, vaulted ceiling. Dusty shelves lined the walls, crammed with forgotten tomes and neglected volumes that seemed to pulsate with a strange energy. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something ancient and ominous that lay beneath the surface waiting to be discovered. "This place is incredible," Chris murmured, stepping into the room. His voice echoed softly in the cavernous space. "I didn't know schools like this even had libraries like this." "Neither did I," Natalie replied, her eyes wide as she took in the sheer size of the room. It felt out of place, too grand for a school like St. Mark's Academy. It's like it's been hidden away. The group moved deeper into the library, their flashlights revealing rows of old desks and reading tables, each covered in a thick layer of dust. The shelves were filled with books of all shapes and sizes, some with titles so worn that they were barely legible. There was an eerie stillness to the room, as if it had been untouched for decades. As they explored, Jenna approached a large, ornate desk at the center of the room. On it lay an open ledger, the pages yellowed with age. She flipped through it, her eyes widening as she recognized some of the names. "These are the students who died in the fire," Jenna whispered, her finger tracing the faded ink. "It's like a record of everyone who was here." Natalie leaned over to look, her heart sinking as she saw the names. There were dozens of them, each name followed by a date. September 14th, 1980, the day the fire had consumed the school. But there was something else on the page that caught her eye, a series of strange symbols scrawled in the margins next to certain names. They were intricate, almost ritualistic, and they made her skin crawl. "What do you think these mean?" Natalie asked, pointing to the symbols. Chris examined them closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know," he admitted, "but they look like they could be some kind of code or ritual markings. Maybe this place was used for more than just a school." Marcus, who had been scanning the shelves, suddenly stopped and pulled out a large leather-bound book. The cover was embossed with a symbol similar to the ones in the ledger. "This might have something to do with it," he said, handing the book to Natalie. She opened it cautiously, the old pages crackling under her fingers. The book was filled with strange, arcane texts, rituals, diagrams, and handwritten notes that seemed to detail dark practices, many of which were associated with fire and purification. The more she read, the more she realized that the school had been hiding a dark secret, one that had somehow been tied to the tragic events of that fateful day. "I think the fire was more than just an accident," Natalie said, her voice trembling. "There's something darker here, something that was meant to happen." Before anyone could respond, a loud thud echoed through the library, the sound of heavy books falling to the floor. The group jumped, their flashlights darting to the source of the noise, only to find a section of the shelves had collapsed, revealing a hidden doorway behind it. The door was small, almost unnoticeable, and it looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. Chris approached it cautiously, his hand hovering over the knob. "Should we see what's behind it?" Natalie nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But they had come too far, and the mystery of the school demanded answers. Chris opened the door, and a rush of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The steps were worn, slick with moisture, as if they led to a place deep below the school, a place that had been sealed away for a reason. "We need to go down there, don't we?" Jenna asked, her voice small. Natalie met her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. "I think so. Whatever is haunting this school, whatever caused the fire, it's down there, and if we want to get out of here, we need to face it." With a deep breath, they descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing them whole as they ventured into the unknown depths of St. Mark's Academy. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with each step they took. Natalie knew they were close to the heart of the mystery, the source of the malevolent force that had claimed so many lives. But as they descended further into the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one that had been set long before they had even arrived at the school, and whatever waited for them at the bottom of the stairs was ready to claim them too. The staircase seemed endless, the darkness growing thicker with each step they took. The cold, damp air pressed against their skin, making it difficult to breathe. The only sound was the faint echo of their footsteps, swallowed by the void that surrounded them. Natalie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how far they had come and how close they were to confronting the evil that had ensnared them in St. Mark's Academy. Finally, the stairs ended at a small, dimly lit landing. A single door stood before them, old and worn, its surface marked with the same strange symbols they had seen in the library. The door pulsed with a faint, malevolent energy, as if it were alive, waiting for them to cross its threshold. "This is it," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. "Whatever's behind this door, it's the source of everything." Jenna clung to Marcus, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't want to go in there," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to know what's inside." "We don't have a choice," Marcus replied, though he looked just as frightened. "If we want to get out of here, we have to face it." Natalie nodded, her resolve hardening. She reached out and grasped the door handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through her fingers. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a large cavernous room bathed in an eerie red light. The walls of the room were lined with ancient, crumbling stone, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of ash, as if it had been the site of countless fires. At the center of the room stood a massive, ornate bell, suspended from a rusted metal frame. The bell was cracked and blackened, its surface scorched by flames. Yet it emanated a powerful, pulsing energy, like the heartbeat of the school itself. "This is where it happened," Natalie whispered, her eyes fixed on the bell. "This is where the fire started." Chris took a step closer to the bell, his flashlight casting long, twisted shadows across the room. "It looks like it hasn't been touched in decades," he said, his voice filled with awe and fear. "But why is it still here? Why wasn't it destroyed in the fire?" "Because it's not just a bell," Natalie replied, her voice trembling. "It's something more, something that was used in a ritual to bind the spirits of the students and teachers to this place." As if in response to her words, the bell began to vibrate, a low, ominous hum that filled the room. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of burning wood. Suddenly, the room was filled with the distant sound of voices, cries of pain and terror, the final moments of the students and teachers trapped in the fire. "They're reliving it," Jenna whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "The fire, it's happening all over again." Natalie's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The bell was the key to everything: the fire, the spirits, the curse that had plagued St. Mark's Academy for decades. If they could somehow break the connection, they might be able to free the spirits and end the nightmare once and for all. "We have to destroy it," Natalie said, her voice filled with determination. "We have to break the bell." "But how?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. "It's massive. We don't have anything that could—" Before he could finish, the bell let out a deafening clang, the sound reverberating through the room like a shockwave. The walls shook, and the red light intensified, filling the room with a hellish glow. The ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a pit of fire and brimstone that seemed to reach into the very depths of the earth. "We're running out of time," Natalie shouted over the roar of the flames. "We need to find a way to destroy it now." Chris looked around desperately, his eyes landing on a rusted old sledgehammer leaning against the wall. Without a word, he grabbed it and ran toward the bell, his face set with determination. "Get back!" he yelled, raising the sledgehammer above his head. The others scrambled to the edges of the room, watching with bated breath as Chris brought the hammer down on the bell with all his strength. The impact was deafening, a sharp, metallic ring that echoed through the room. The bell cracked further, its surface splintering like shattered glass. The red light flickered, and the flames in the pit began to wane, their intensity diminishing as the connection between the bell and the spirits weakened. "Keep going," Natalie urged, her heart racing. "You're almost there." Chris swung the hammer again and again, each strike driving the bell closer to destruction. With one final mighty blow, the bell shattered, sending shards of metal flying across the room. The red light vanished, plunging them into darkness as the pit of fire closed up, sealing the gateway to whatever malevolent force had been controlling the school. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the world holds its breath in the aftermath of destruction. Then, slowly, the room began to warm, and a soft golden light filled the space. The air was no longer thick with the scent of smoke and ash, but was instead clean, almost sweet. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them since they entered the school lifted, and the voices of the dead faded away, their cries of pain replaced by a peaceful stillness. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice filled with relief and disbelief. "We did it." Natalie took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her body finally release. The school had been purged of its evil, the spirits freed from their torment. But as they turned to leave, the sound of a bell chimed softly behind them, a final toll, a reminder of the dark history that would forever linger in the halls of Essie.